Welcome to Botanica's month 1 video tutorial. We do everything in one take, so you're going to get that flub up too. All right, so kind of looking back on this block of the month, we knew that we were doing something very new for the very first time of doing a block of the month that is completely in the hoop. So as we went through, we got some feedback and we realized we kind of need to give just a little bit more assistance. So what we're doing is we're basically restarting from part 1. If you have already started, continue forward. Don't change, just keep going through. You can watch those other video tutorials in future months. But if you haven't gotten started, which wouldn't that be a shocker, Ashley? I mean, don't we all do our block of the months on month 1? But if you happen to be in that minority that hasn't started yet, these videos should hopefully help you get started. Also, since it's in video, if God forbid, it's a year from now that you finally get started, you have these videos to kind of help refresh all of the information you've gotten so far. So with that said, let me go ahead and get started. Now, in month 1, the first thing I want to talk about are your embroidery files. In every single one of your botanical emails, at the bottom we have instructions on how to get your files from AnitaGoodDesign. The big, huge gotcha is that they only allow you to download 2 or 3 times. So if you plan on going back every month to download your files, it's not going to let you. So as requirement of this block of the month, you had to pay for that CD. So what I've done is in the email for the video tutorial, you have a link to the PDF and you have a link to some of the embroidery files. So I've included files that are compatible for Baby Locks, Brothers, Genomes, Bernina, and Husqvarna Viking VIP files. So those should help you. If you are one of our members that needs a different file extension, reach out to us and we will include that on the list. But those are the machine types I knew of when I was putting together this video. So I think I covered what all of our users are using, at least for this block of the month. In addition, I've included all the sizes. So there's A, B, C, and there's also a AA and a AAA. For this block of the month, you pick one letter code. Let's say, for example, on this one, every single month I used the AAA size, okay? Every single month, I only used the file that was AAA. In your video tutorials, we're going to do it on the smallest one, which is the C size. That's the smallest you can go. If you were to download your files from AnitaGoodDesign, you'll notice there's a D file. You cannot use the D size on this particular project. So here, I'm using the C size. So this means that in every single one of our block of the months video tutorials, you'll be seeing it in the smaller size. So Ashley asked, in case you couldn't hear, what determines which size letter code I can use? It's really dependent on your machine. What is the max hoop size your machine can handle? So on this particular machine, the max hoop size is a 6x9. And for the, I'm looking at my notes, guys, for the C, the blocks, you have to have a minimum hoop size of 6x6. So that means this can support the size C. 6x6 does fit within 6x9. But if I picked B, the hoop size, minimum hoop size is 7x7. Well, the max hoop size here is 6x9. You can't fit a 7x7 in a 6x9 hoop size. So thanks for asking. This is the only video in all of them where I'm going to cover supplies. I'm not a YouTube genius. Hopefully Emily can help us figure out how to tag this as the supplies section. You only need to hear this once. It applies for all the other block of the months, and I'm only going to cover it in month 1. If you're looping back to this one just to hear this section, great. If you've already heard this, skip over to the construction side of this video. Again, I technically don't know how to do that. Emily will figure that out for us. So let's talk about supplies. All right, so normally I machine embroider with a 70-11 size needle. You can't do that with this. When I was doing it, I was noticing micro runs in my fabric. So that's no bueno, and it was because my needle was not thick enough. I had to go up to a 90-14. Now, there's a $1 difference between these two. These are gold plated, these are normal looking. Schmetz would love to tell you that these last longer. They don't. but they are super easy to identify in your sewing room. So you know my gold-plated ones are my embroidery needles. So that's why you only find me using the gold-plated ones simply from a visual cue. I know at the kickoff party, a lot of you guys were told to use the fusible no-show. I did not like it. So if you've already purchased it, stay with it. I don't want you to waste your money. If you haven't opened it and you want to bring it back in and exchange it for what I'm about to say, go for it. As long as you haven't opened it, we'll take it in, okay? If you've opened it and used it for one project, talk to me. I'll negotiate with you. We'll exchange it and I'll just mark off 10% of the refund. Just work with me. I want you guys to be happy with the tools that you pick. That's it right there. What I preferred was piece and stitch, and it's actually designed specifically for block of the month, blocks in the hoop type projects. I really did like this stuff. What I did not like about no-show is that you couldn't cut it off after. And I prefer, just from the drapiness of my block, I want this to feel as much like a real quilt as possible. So I really like the drapiness, but the way I did that was I removed all the stabilizer after. If you use no-show, you can't do that easily. It's not easy at all. So what I would recommend is, if you have at home a tearaway wash away. Now, I've emailed Dime about this a couple of times. This is promoted as a tearaway wash away. Washes away, it says it's a 1.5 ounce wash away tearaway. I have sprayed it, I have soaked it, I have done everything. There is no wash away to this wash away. So I have contacted Dime and I'm like, we have a problem here. So, but what I do love about it, and the reason I still continued using it even though it didn't wash away at all, was because it's a 1.5 ounce tearaway. That means it's a very light tearaway. And that means it tears very easy. When we do construction, you'll see why I still use this anyway, because of that 1.5 ounce. Now they do have a tearaway wash away. I will be stocking in the store. I have to test it before I can vouch that it actually washes away, because this sucker didn't. But that's what I used on the back. Then you have to have a water soluble topping. You can't get away from that, because we're going to be doing a lot of the edge cutting. You have little tiny threads there. You don't want those to poke up through your machine embroidery. You've got to put a topper anywhere you're going to be doing satin stitching. So those are my two recommendations on stabilizer. Next, you need duckbills. So you need a standard size. This is a good 6-inch. I also had a smaller size, and I had an even smaller size than that. These are curved, very sharp. These two I used whenever we were doing more intricate cutting. This is for the everyday. I also, in removing my background, my stabilizer, I used a curved awl. I used tweezers. And then I had this right here. It's just, it's for finger pressing. I apologize, I don't know what it's called, but it's just for finger pressing whenever I felt like I wasn't doing a good enough job, or just to hold down larger sections. Actually went into my sewing notions box and I'm like, oh my God, that'll actually help me here. First time though. So, because other than that, I really wasn't sure what it was for. And then of course you need a seam ripper. All right, now in this particular block of the month, I picked out 4 colors for the satin stitching, and that was it. Like, those are my 4 colors for this entire block of the month. So those I kind of chose in the beginning. I matched them up to the fabrics. These were the 4 colors I've chosen. They're outlined in this email where you're getting this video tutorial of what exactly they are. And I literally stuck them in a plastic bag, threw them to the side, and those are my official colors. Now for sewing, I used black thread. And I also used black bobbin thread throughout the whole process. It was just easier that way. So I was still using bobbin thread in the parts where I had to sew. For purposes of this video tutorial, so you can actually see what I'm doing, I'm using a neon orange. That is the end of the supplies discussion. So here, now we're going to start construction. Okay, so let's get started on construction. So first thing we're going to do is, just so you know, you've got to make 4 blocks of these. Whatever you do, do not forget to leave an overhang of about 1/2 inch whenever you're trimming. But we're going to go ahead and cover that as we're going here. So the first thing you do is, as you load in the files, you're going to do your tack down stitch. You've already been given pre-cut batting.
Say that again. Sorry, I wasn't recording.
Okay, now?
Yeah.
Okay, so in your kit, you've been given pre-cut batting. When you put it on, make life easier for you. Get as close to one line and the other line. That's less for you to trim off later. Just let the other part just kind of flow here. So I'm making sure I'm covering up my top line and my left line. It's just 2 less lines I've got to trim. And that's always a good thing. Sometimes I do keep my hand on it. Just kind of make sure it gets caught in there. So after that, you want to remove it. Now here I accidentally missed the stitch, and that's where you saw me kind of trying to make sure it stayed under the foot. It's okay if this happens a couple times. Try not to let that happen. But if it does happen like this, that is not a reason for you to go back and start from the beginning. This is okay. But in general, just trying to make sure you do get it underneath there. I also want you to notice that when I lay down this hoop, I've laid it down, well, it's partially on this block, but overall, it is laying down on a flat surface. That is really important. Not on your knee, not on the edge of the table, on a flat surface. The duckbill part goes underneath. And I like to lift as I snip. So Emily, I actually don't call these my duckbills. These are my belugas. They look like a beluga whale. So when you cut off your batting, you want to cut it as close to that edge as you can. And by having it already one corner here, it was just a little bit less. I didn't have to trim because there's a lot of trimming in this block of the month. Next is your placement stitch for the next one. This is where the next one's going to go. Since I didn't quite catch it, I'm just kind of making sure this foot stays on top of the batting and doesn't sneak under it like it just did right there. So I have to kind of help nudge it around. Again, that's why you don't want to miss one of those edges like I did, because it just means you got to pay attention a little bit closer. I love this fluorescent thread. It's so easy to see what's going on. And I'm just putting my hand here because I didn't quite do a good job there. Okay, on this first one, you'll be using black fabric. And on this one, if you look at your screen, it shows it's going to stitch down another triangle. So that what that means is everything, we're just going to basically applique it right in place. These are some of the easiest ones to do. So I'm going to make sure I cover all of that triangle, and I always make sure I have excess here and excess here. Also notice I did not use the entire piece of black fabric. I just used a quarter of it. I knew that that was going to be enough to cover that area. Now I'm going to put my foot down. Move this over just a little bit more. And I'm going to hit start, and that's going to now stitch down the fabric where it goes. Okay, so now I'm going to remove it from here. Now here's where you just have to remember, we're only cutting the inner stitches. This we're all going to leave because we've got to make sure we remember that 1/2 inch border. You could, if you wanted to, go ahead and cut right here. So we know we have visually more than 1/2 inch so that we can use this also on the other side. So we'll place that scrap here. Now when I have this here, what I do is I'll start and cut along the square and then cut very close inside, inside. Just like that, okay? Okay, so this next one, you'll notice if you look at the screen, Your next line is just a line. And if you've ever done FPP, this is very similar. So what we do is we actually tack it down here and we flip it over. But a lot of times it's really hard for us to see where it's going to flip at. So what I recommend is, until you get better with that technique, deal with exaggeratingly large pieces of fabric. If there's anywhere where you might have to go back and seam rip out, this is it. So what I do is I like to quote unquote audition. I'll put it upside down where I know that straight line is going to go, and then I flip it over and I feel to make sure I'm going to have at least 1/2 inch here and 1/2 inch here. So I can see I'm pretty close. So I'm just actually going to lay it down there. Now, as you get better, you do not have to remove from the hoop to do this part. I'm doing this just so I can double check before I put it in that, yes, that's where I want that straight line to go. As I got better and better, I could know that I could just lay down the fabric flat and I knew it was going to flip over into the correct direction. Again, those who know FPP, you will probably be old pro at this. But for those of us who are brand new to foundation paper piecing, just removing it quickly from the hoop and just giving it a good eyeball check and a test flip will really make a huge difference, and you won't have to hit that seam ripper as much as I had to. Okay, so now it is ready to go. So I'm going to remove this just so you can see what I'm going to do. And also, I'm at a really awkward angle with the camera. I'm going to, and I always did this in the hoop. I very rarely had to move it, but look at what angle I'm at. So it kind of makes it a little bit harder. So I'm going to fold this over and I'm going to finger press. This was where I used one of the tools. Also, you have a tool from the seam roller from Violet Craft. That's also a very good one to use here as well. And I just used it to help me really flatten down that line. That was really, really important. Kind of notice I'm just kind of pushing it out of the way. All right, and now whenever I did it, even here, I would keep my hand and just made sure it was keeping taut. Okay, so now I know it's tedious, but you gotta cut all of these pieces. Just don't cut the outers, just the inner. So now we're going to do our next placement stitch. So here's an actual example of how I was working at home. It's a little bit harder at the angle here, so I'm going to come around the back. I did not go around the back at home. I knew my piece was much bigger than what I needed. I'd place it here. Flip it over. Again, I worked from the front of my machine at home, but I was at a better angle than I am here. Give this a real tight, crisp finger press. And I've got this all nice and taut. And then when I hit to go again, I even still kind of make sure it's nice and taut. This what makes for a really nice, clean finish. And I know this part may seem tedious about cutting all of this, but this is what's going to reduce the bulk in your quilt and really make it something enjoyable to use at home. So you want to go ahead and take the time, even though it is tedious. Remember, your outer edges, you've got to leave at least 1/2 inch. That is really important. That was one part I had to constantly be reminding myself of. But those inners, we cut those down to as close as we can get them. All right, so you notice I've got a lot of extra here, got my little extra here because that's out and out, but the rest on the inside is cut as close as I can get it. This is one of my favorite blocks because it really does cover a lot of the basics you need to know and use in the rest of it. So the next one is our placement stitch. We have that black square from the beginning that we knew was big enough. Okay, and here, I'm going to place it here, and I can even test it and make sure, am I still going to get my 1/2 inch everywhere. Yep, I should. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to move it down just a little bit more. And then I know that should be big enough, so I'm going to go ahead and tack that down. All right, so now if you notice here, I'm going to flip over and I've got plenty of fabric. But if you notice, I have a lot of extra fabric here. Just like everywhere else, you really need to take that time, and yes, it is tedious, but you need to clip that off. Now in FPP, for my FPP experts out there, you guys normally leave 1/4 inch. You don't need to do that in this type of stitching. You can cut it right up to the line. That is different than a normal FPP. We're going to take this, we're going to push it over. I still have more than 1/2 inch all the way around. That's good. And again, remember how we talked about we're trying to get really nice tight lines here. And kind of put that there. And come over here. And now we're going to do the tack down stitch for that. So one of the things you have to be really patient about with this block of the month is the removing of the hoop and the putting it back in, removing and the putting it back in. The best habit I can tell you is always work with the flat surface, not your knee, and not with the hoop upward in front of you. Discipline on this really will help you in the end. Okay, we're going to do our next placement stitch. Now this one is by far one of my favorites. You have a square up here, but it's not just any square. The way they did it was not a flip and stitch. They just did it where you put it on top. So look at your fabric. Now this is not the fabric you got in your kits. We'll have a month 7 fixes kit and this fabric will be in there. Instead of just stitching it out, look at the fabric. There's so much visually interesting on this fabric, and figure out what you want to have in that square. You see the square here. I really like this flower right here. So I'm going to put that flower there, and I'm going to feel where that stitch is around, and until I find how I want my flower placed. And I'm thinking right about here. And I can feel my square, and I can kind of go over and go, yeah, I think that'll be a really nice placement. So you can add some visual interest to your quilt. This I did remove from the hoop just to kind of take my time and figure out where I wanted that fabric to be. And then now it's going to do the tack down stitch. And I'm putting gentle pressure on the fabric to keep it nice and tight. Now remember, we only need to snip from the inner, not the outer. But I have a lot of excess fabric. So I'm just going to rough cut. Now I can better see where I've got to do my applique snipping. So for this next part, you really want to have a topper that's going to go over where the satin stitch is going to happen, because that's all we have left over is the satin stitching. So that's, you don't need a full topper for your entire hoop. You just need enough of what's going to cover it. On this particular one, use your own creativity. But if you want someone to tell you which color did I used the shimmering gold. But to be honest, I think the passion would have worked just as well here. The most critical thing, in my opinion, would be to use the same color on all of them across all 4 hoops. But hey, even then, go ahead and mix up the colors if you want. We do want you to do creatively what you feel is best. But for us, we used the gold. Okay, I've got my new thread installed for the satin stitches, and I've got my topper on top as well. I do kind of hold on to my topper until the stitching gets tacked down. So it's going to go around there and around there. And at this point I let go and I let it go ahead and finish out the satin stitch. So now we're done with our block. As you can see, all of the outer is still there. All we really did our trimming was on the inside. If you've used a water soluble topper, the real thin kind, this should tear right off. All right, so I removed from the hoop. And the first thing I do is I trim down my block. Remember, we're leaving a 1/2 inch all the way around the block. All right, so here we are. Here's our finished block. Now, we could stop here, but here's the problem. It's just too stiff. Do you see what I mean? It doesn't have flow. So I know that this next part is tedious, but that's where these tools come into play. I'm going to now remove all the stabilizer that I can easily get to. All right, all done. And I know it's tedious. I know it's very tedious, but now it flows more of the way I expect a block to feel before it's going to be in the final quilting. It's not going to flow or have the liquidity as you would like a normal sewn together block, but it lays better. I can't explain why. Every now and then you get these kind of things where the batting isn't quite secured down or the threads aren't quite secured down. This is not a reason to go through and redo your block. This is perfectly fine, okay? And like I have another one here, perfectly fine. Not a good reason for a redo. Most of them though are gonna look like this. But if you see this happen, don't redo it. All right, so now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm gonna go and give this a good press. Now, here, this is very important, you know. You cannot press over satin stitching, okay? So if I needed to press here, I would go and put a pressing cloth over this part. I would not press over that. This does have a very low melting point. All I'm really looking to press are the places where we have done the fold overs. I want these to be very crisp. I'm going to make sure my iron does not touch this at all. All right, I'll be right back. All right, see, you have two different samples right here. This one is pressed and this one's not. I don't know if you can tell the difference, but this one is lying so much flatter, looks so much crisper and sharp, and then this one just doesn't look the same. So giving it a really good press is very, very important. So next we're gonna learn how to pin these together for sewing it together. So when you sew this together, you want this to come out like an X. So obviously we're gonna flip this over. Where I pinned was right at, and Emily, you'll have to help me because I don't know the best way to show this, is right at those fabric joins. That is where you want to make sure you put in that very first pin, because that's the most important thing to line up. Your next one is on the other side of the X, even though we're not going to be stitching there. But we want to make sure it matches up too for later. All right, and then over here, the next place that I pin is at the beginning and at the end. So here, I'm looking at these two lines, and I'm making sure we get those right together. Can you see that? And then over here, this one isn't as important, but because I'm using really bright threads, you can see I really want to make sure I get those two corners pinned up as well. When I stitch it, you will notice you have an outer line and an inner line. I use this inner line as my guide to do a 1/4 inch to the left of there. You want to make sure you have a consistent line that you are following, so that when you get to the end of this project, everything's going to join correctly. Now, here's a downside. This second line is not always easily visible to see. So you may want to also look at this line. Either way, follow one of them and you do a 1/4 inch to the inside. I'm going to use the same bright thread so you can see what is going on when I'm sewing this. When I did do this at home though, What I used for my stitching, I actually used hot pink at home, if you can believe that. But then when I did my final stitching of the blocks together, I used a gray thread. So you can use different color threads. It's not supposed to be seen. All right, I'll be right back. Yeah, okay. All right, so what I did is I stitched it together. And remember, one side wasn't pressed and the other, well, now they're both pressed. I did not go anywhere near the satin stitching. So now, by carefully pinning, I was able to get that join spot on. Now this one I'm off a little. I know a lot of you out there are meticulous. You would go back and redo. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. But this one, it's just too small for me to really care. You'll notice I have roughly 1/4 of an inch here. So that will get eaten up whenever I do my next 2 of these X's. On the back as well, you'll notice I pressed my seam open. This is that neon thread that you were seeing that I was putting it together just so you could visually see easily where my stitch lines are at. So I went ahead and I pressed this open. So that's also very, very important. And then that is it. You are done. Once you do your next 2 squares, join these 2 together. You'll have these 2 joined together, and then you join the long strip. Just take the time to always pin at every fabric join. You'll notice on mine, I didn't quite land it exactly in the middle. I did notice when I opened up my seam, you could see some of my understitching. So here, I did not have that problem. But every now and then when I was first learning, you could see some of the understitching that was for putting together the block, and I just seam ripped those out. It happened one time for me on this entire quilt, so I think I actually just made a mistake on that block. But I want you to notice, by taking the time to do those squares and making sure it's visually interesting, you can make something like this, where all 4 of those squares in and of themselves are part of that block design. Which is one of the reasons this was one of my very, very favorite blocks to do. You will also notice you get a lot of this fuzz from the batting because it's part of this process on this block. I wouldn't worry about that. That's something we can take care of just with a piece of sticky tape or something like that and get that off of there pretty easy. I wouldn't worry about that part. That is pretty much everything that I have for you for tips and tricks. I've also written down everything inside the email where you got this video. There's links to all the different products that I mentioned. This is the C size, this is the AAA size, so yours will probably land somewhere between these 2. But I hope this information helps you so you're able to complete these blocks. Remember, as part of the block of the month, we are always here to help. We will have more sit and sew sessions for this one that are in the evening. I will include a link to those as well if you're still having any troubles putting your block together. Or you can also email us at education@urbanspools.com. That's everything I got. I hope you have a wonderful time, and I hope this helps you. And we'll see you at the next one.